Okay, we're back. So just moving on to the next build option here. This is my Nightblade Tank, it looks like. Happy Imperial. It's one thing, looking at the armory system that they've got out now, in addition to the Mundus Stone being an option, which I'm hoping that gets added in one of these days in the near future. One of the things that I found, it's a great system, definitely a huge addition to the game. It makes it much easier now, not having to create 16 different alts to gain full-on builds. But one of the minor drawbacks is that you can't race change, because there are definitely, if I was doing different builds, oh, she's so loud. I don't know why I park next to her. It's a mistake every time. Doesn't stop talking. The race or the armory specifically, when you're switching between, one of the things that I ended up doing in order to try to gain somewhat of an optimized setup across multiple builds like that, where you're spanning a mag character, a stam character, and a tank, is you don't get to change races as part of that build swapping. So I started looking, probably like a lot of people, I started looking at the characters and the races at, okay, so what do I want to do in terms of, if I'm going to run all three specifically, or I'm running PvP as an additional option, or maybe you're doing trials, who knows. You may want to choose a different race based on, okay, what's going to span all three of these build types. And so Imperial, for me, there were definitely a number that were switched to Imperial because it seems like it's the best in terms of overall overall stats. And I know a lot of people will say, okay, it's the racial differences, it's not that big of a difference, and no, it's not. To be truthful, there's not a huge difference, but there is enough that, I don't know, maybe it just makes me feel better. Imperial seems like it's kind of the best hybrid across all of the different races. Dark Elf is definitely a great alternative as well. I know a lot of people, for damage purposes, go Khajiit, because it is also kind of across the board, all three. And as much as I like Khajiit, I've found personal preference in playstyle, I like Imperial or Dark Elf better. Because again, my focus isn't purely on damage output, and Khajiits always feel a little short when it comes to the resources and survivability. That's just based on my experience and my playstyle though. So Imperial is kind of the go-to for me. Definitely for stam, definitely for tanks, and obviously for mag, not quite as good, but when you're dealing with endgame content, or at least vet dungeon content, I don't do trials really. Vet dungeon content, having that extra health and extra stam is never going to hurt. So it's Imperial seems like a good default choice for me. So this is my Nightblade Tank. Over the years, I've actually run or tested out a number of different build options for Nightblade, and didn't actually have a whole lot of luck. The sap tank approach to tanking was a thing for many, many years. Every time I tried it, I wanted it to work, but I guess just based on the way that I play, it just didn't have the survivability that I was going for, and so wasn't very effective. And so for the first multiple, I'd say first 4+ years of the game, I didn't really have any type of Nightblade tank, and in fact they were kind of back burner, didn't get played. I didn't do builds for them because it just, Nightblade as a tank didn't fit for me. But with more recent changes, well, maybe not recent, the last couple of years basically, I started testing a bit more, and I came up with a setup that actually works quite well. So Malabeth for the helm, and this is the one thing about this is it's very, very survivable, but this is definitely in the category of selfish tank, as the end game players will use the term. So this is definitely about survivability for the tank, but depending on the content, sometimes I like having tanks that are based purely on my own survivability, because some of the content can be deadly. And if I can survive long enough to be able to res players back up, that means we can get through the content. Most of the stuff that we've been through in recent releases hasn't been to the point where I need that level of survivability, but there are definitely some dungeons. It's been a while since I've been in here, so I'm trying to remember the name of it. But there's one dungeon in particular where the mobs, even in there, some of the mob types, their special mob types, hit extremely hard. And if you're not set up properly, both for survivability and the ability to block, so a decent amount of stamina, you're not going to get through the content. It's quite difficult. So this type of setup actually works well for that. So in this case, it looks like I'm wearing Bonnies and Leeching. Again, Leeching for a base set for tanks. It's always good. Defending, reinforced. So I've got basically front and back Leeching, and then running Bonnies on the body. Bannies, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but this is basically creating a tether, which is doing major maim. At some point I would probably redo this. I believe I have another one that's with a similar setup, another Nightblade tank, and they're actually running the one that drops from White Gold Tower that gives shields. I can't remember the name of it right now, but it's a similar thing with Leeching and then a secondary set. So both of the secondary sets are attempting to provide some utility for the group, but for the most part, this is about my own survivability for this tanking setup. And I know they... Okay, so I've got guards set up on this as well, so that's also providing utility for the group. And for the groups that I run with, again, damage isn't the biggest part of the focus. It's more survivability. So this is, I choose Mystic Guard over the one that contributes more to damage. Dark Cloak on a high health tank is extremely good. I don't know if I have food on. No, I don't. She doesn't have any food on, but... Oh, she's only running... Okay, so on this particular setup, I'm only running health and stam. So, good utility. Nightblades actually have both of these, of their ultimates. Under the Shadow Tree, you have Bolstering Darkness. There's a very nice ultimate for the group in terms of healing. And then Siphoning is another good one. So both of these work very, very well. Soul Siphon specifically versus Soul Tether. The morphs work very, very, very well for tanking. Leeching obviously is giving you your resources. Under Shadow, you could potentially run Refreshing Path for some additional healing for the group. That's a good option. You need to make sure you've got enough magicka to support it. Dark Cloak lasts for... That says 5 seconds. Huh. Okay, again, it's been a while since I've been over here. Did that get nerfed or did they reduce something? This used to be 8 seconds. Not 5. And I know I'm not imagining that. That used to be 8 seconds. So essentially on a... what is essentially a pure stam tank, sword and board both bars, the only magicka skill that I had was Dark Cloak. And it would last for 8 seconds. So this got nerfed at some point in the past, and I wasn't aware. It used to last for 8 seconds, but the heal that you're getting from this, you can see, is almost 5,000 every second. This skill alone, for a Nightblade Tank, if you've got a decent amount of health, because it scales off your max health, is fantastic. So it lasts for 5 seconds. That is actually quite a bit higher, because from what I recall, this used to be about mid 3s, like 3,500 every 1 second, which even then was really, really good. So it looks like they reduced the duration but increased the potency of it. So you have to cast this more often. I'd have to test this. I'm assuming it'd still be fine. This is the only magicka skill that I have, and so it worked great with the 8 seconds because essentially your magicka pool easily fills back up. Like, I can cast it multiple times before I even do anything, and over the course of 5 seconds you can see my magicka pool is almost full before I even have to recast it. And the heal that you get from this is a huge part of the survivability. I mean, it's fantastic. 5,600, oh look at that, 8,200 on a crit. It's nuts. And back when I was running this, it's changed now, but there was... which one was it? I believe it was Relentless Focus. This used to have... they had it briefly for about 3 to 6 months, I want to say. This used to have a morph where it would reduce the amount of damage. Rather than firing off the spectral bow or whatever it is that you get, if you held on to it, it would reduce... per second, I believe it would reduce it by 10 or 2% or something to that effect. Ultimately, it was a 10% damage reduction that you just cast, and then you never hit again. So as a tank, you're taking 10% less damage. They switched it back to where now it's more focused on doing damage again, so we lost that, and I switched over to Mirage just for some additional resistance. But so this build has gotten nerfed a little bit over time, but that, even though it's reduced duration, that's actually a nice solid buff. And the other beauty of this is that being a shadow ability, this is gaining you your excuse me, this one, well, any of these, being a shadow ability, when you cast it, or the ultimates, you're gaining resistances. So 2,600 actually seems low for this setup. Hmm. 29 now with the additional of with Mirage going. Interesting. Okay, so I guess the resistances are a little bit lower. They're perfectly fine for tanking the bulk of the content you're going to run into. No issues whatsoever. I've seen tanks run anywhere from like 2,500, oh, excuse me, 2,500, 25,000 to 28. Anywhere in there is a good setup. A lot of my tanks tend to be in the 30 plus, but it's not a necessity. So, and this was set up with guard as well to kind of help my teammates for survivability. You've got a CC. I don't, this particular setup does not have any type of chaining, so it's kind of lacking in that area. I definitely prefer, if I have access to it, I prefer to be able to chain in, but in this case it looks like I sacrificed the chaining for the guard. But you could easily swap that out. Go with the Fighters Guild and then do the morph that goes to Silver Leash. And then you can pull people in. I don't even have that morphed over here. So this is definitely a solid setup, and apparently it's now even more survivable with the additional healing, so nice. And you've got Malabeth on top of that, so Malabeth is pulling in not so much the heal itself, but I believe it was Major Vitality. So all of the healing that you are getting from Dark Cloak is being further buffed by your helm. I know he's a vampire, I don't know what he's running. Gotta cover up that ugly mug. This is undoubtedly going to be a Magblade setup. Vampire is another one of those areas that I know a lot of people are still waiting for them to fix it. Kind of sad to say they spent an entire year essentially focused on vampires, and the end result just kind of missed the mark, in my opinion. I was actually someone who was looking forward to being able to play full-time as a vampire, kind of like with Werewolf, but it's the initial release had some decent build options, although even the initial release when it came out was problematic depending on what you wanted to use for their skills. I think this is probably yeah, okay, so this is, I think I had previous builds on here. It looks like I switched it to a fairly standard Magblade setup. I'm running New Moon, Slimecraw when it used to be good. I guess the crit chance is a little higher on the helm, or on the One Piece. Minor Berserk was only 5%, so that got nerfed a while back as well. So I don't know that I would run this setup. It's got the visuals on the arms, but who cares? This is probably not what I would run nowadays. New Moon's decent. Mother's Sorrow, I probably just had laying around, honestly. I know people are really big on Mother's Sorrow. I've never been a huge fan, just because, yeah, it comes with crit, but again, I like fun factor, and since New Moon already doesn't have any type of visual or bonus effects like that, this just is so boring. It's so boring to me. And you look on Outcast and some of the other sites, and it's just False God's Devotion, Mother's Sorrow, One Piece Slimecraw, and another crit piece. Or like they're probably running the Kilt. And then you go to a different class, and you look up the mag build for that class, you're thinking, oh, okay, well I went from Nightblade to Warden. Let me see what Warden's doing. Exact same setup. Because they determined in their testing that that particular setup came up with the most DPS, and so we're going to use it on all our builds. It's so boring, so unimaginative. There's no fun factor at all. It's purely about, what are my damage numbers going out? Are they as high as they can possibly be? Okay, then I'm going to run that. And it surprises me that the same builds can be run across multiple classes because you'd think there'd be more variety in the class skills and the damage output, so that they would kind of force you to choose different set options for different, but apparently that's not the case. You can use these same setups across multiple classes, so that's the main reason why I don't run Mother's Sorrow. There's nothing impressive about it other than it's decent damage. I definitely like a fun factor in the builds, so Maelstrom, Infused Inferno, and New Moon Inferno on the front. So this is it's a pretty standard setup, and probably one that I would not play all that often just because it's kind of boring. I know mag blades are decent for damage output, but Empire. Yeah. One of these days I'll probably come back and do something fun with this one. Duramain Abu Dhabi. Good old Khajiit. Khajiit, Bow, and Skyrim. You can't beat it. I like Khajiit for the lore, but their stat pool, the way that they've kind of divvied up things and spread them across, it's always felt too thin for me. So as much as I love playing Khajiit Nightblade, I don't know. It's probably the playstyle and the builds and that kind of thing, but I like more survivability built into my characters when I play them, and Khajiit, with their current stat pools and stuff, just feels a little lacking. And that's clearly just me and my playstyle, personal preference, because I know a lot of people go to Khajiit specifically for the damage.
The Khajiit have suffered much.
Yes, he knows. He is a Khajiit. I would hazard a guess that a lot of people end up going Khajiit, or at least it's a good choice for endgame, because in that trial you can focus purely on damage, and there's a lot of incoming healing and buffs and various things that help with the survivability. I find for dungeon content, specifically like vet dungeon content, I don't enjoy playing Khajiit as much, because it's more, the content is difficult enough that it's going to kill you, but relying on the group for survivability isn't, especially when you're doing pickup groups, that kind of thing, you can't really rely on them for survivability, so Khajiit feels squishy to me. Khajiit is squishy. Let's see what we got for a build them. Balorg, Brigand, Wild Hunt, Moon. This is all over the place. New Moon, Balorg for the damage. Got a Wild Hunt ring. This is quite possibly one of the best mythics in the game, in my opinion. I'm sure endgame doesn't use this at all. They could care less, but for solo play, Wild Hunt is so much fun. The speed boost is, especially for a Khajiit Nightblade, come on, this is fantastic. So it looks like New Moon infused weapon damage, Wild Hunt swift with weapon damage, so we're getting good speed there. Nurnhone Maul, infused, 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 And then Spriggans just for the pen. If I recall, this was an updated, just to get back to kind of a dungeon setup to where I could actually do some decent damage. I created him originally. My goal was to try to build an actual Khajiit bow sniping build that could actually one-shot enemies. And my initial setup actually succeeded. But then they nerfed. It was using, probably still have it on me. What was the set? Let's see. Titanborn. Yeah. So here's the original build. And because other people, unfortunately, I was using it for PvE. It was definitely more of an RP build, but it was fun. I was using Titanborn because the lower the health, the more pen and damage you get from Titanborn. But because people were using that in PvP, PvPers complained it's OP, and so they switched Titanborn, like many of the other sets, to where you have to be in combat before you get any of the buffs. So it essentially destroyed the entire build. With not an exaggeration, it destroyed the build because this was dependent on being in sneak, in stealth. He was a vampire before, which I'm guessing now no longer a vampire. Oh no, it's still a vampire. Okay. It was a vampire, stage 4. So he had the speed once you start sprinting from that, where you could cloak. And it also gave me, at stage 4, the ability to lower my health to a fixed amount, and it didn't recover. So you lower your health down to, I believe it was below 25%, something like that, which is obviously critically low. But you're in stealth, and it maximized the damage and the penetration for Titanborn. And then I was running snipe on the bow. It was a whole combination of things, along with channeled acceleration, which of course is increasing your crit damage. It was a whole combination of things, but the end result was, I want to say, I was hitting snipes for between like 40 and 50,000. Which, I don't know, maybe that's not that high. I remember testing and they were lower before, but with that build I was able to actually one-shot some enemies. Not all enemies, obviously, and certainly not bosses. But it was fun to just be able to build something that was similar to Skyrim in terms of the gameplay with a bow, where you were able to go and just one-shot an enemy. That was the ultimate goal. The Titanborn change kind of ruined the whole build, so I went and ended up back to... This was probably another, I had these in my bank, so I just threw them on. And unfortunately, I haven't played him much since. So, kept him around, hope to do something with him at some point. Spriggans is a good set. That's definitely a solid set, but it's kind of right up there with Mother's Sorrow or some of the other ones. There's no visual effects with it. No way to really even know it's working other than you can look at a stat sheet. I do prefer at least one of the sets that I'm wearing to provide some sort of visual effects, just because it's adds to the fun factor when you're playing the character. Alright, Stamplar. What do we got here? Balorg. Always a good choice. Oh, speaking of Titanborn, so this is probably where the Titanborn set from the Khajiit went. I'm still kind of on the fence with Titanborn. If you're in combat, you're liable to be able to be taking hits, and so your health being underneath 75% is not all that uncommon. And I believe statistically, when you work out the numbers, this ends up actually being slightly better than Spriggans when you are under the 75% health. Plus you're gaining the additional weapon and spell damage on top of it. Well, actually, I'm looking at the numbers. Yeah, I think it does. With that first offensive penetration bonus plus the double that you get from under 75, I believe that's how it ends up working out. So it's decent, especially if you're running harder content where you know you're going to be taking hits like that. This is actually it's a nice option. And again, you don't have to. It's not gimmicky in the sense that you have to do something specifically to activate it. It just kicks in. And anything with pen, in terms of a bonus on the armor, 2, 3, or 4 piece, is, in my opinion, for my style of gameplay, the content that I play, is almost always going to be better than something without it. But that doesn't necessarily apply to trials or endgame. Well, trials basically, because you're probably going to be over penetrating at that point. But for 4-man and for solo, it's having a penetration bonus is a very nice thing. So he's got that, and then Brier Heart. Okay, Brier Heart is another solid set, even still. So Maelstrom infused bow on the back, and then Brier Heart on the front, because of course, when you do critical damage, you get the bonus, and I'm running Stampede, which is guaranteed to be a crit strike. So yeah, this is probably from what I remember, this was a decent setup. So I've got a gap closer that automatically crits, which then activates Brier Heart on the front bar, so I've got guaranteed proccing of Brier Heart. Plus the Titanborn, plus the Balorg. And Balorg plus Flawless is actually a pretty nice setup. Gain the increased weapon and spell damage for 20 seconds. And the cost of this, it's 118, so it's not the highest ultimate, but it's enough that you get a decent bonus out of Balorgs. Balorg is for Stam builds, Balorg is definitely a solid set to run. So nothing too fancy on this. Orc, because why not? Due to recent updates in the last when did they make those adjustments? It's been a year already? They made some minor adjustments to the racial passives a little while back. I want to say maybe it's been close to a year, but so Orc got nerfed a little bit in terms of the health. I think that was it. I want to say they used to have a max health of like 1500. Yeah, it must have been 1500 because only Imperials have 2000. But they've always been a solid choice for Stam damage dealers. Now because they have weapon and spell damage, I guess decent choice for mag too, actually. They don't have any Magicka bonuses specifically to the Magicka pool, but again, it's like the Imperial Stam is always a good choice. You're always going to need Stam. And then weapon and spell damage guarantees that you're going to be boosting whatever you're running. It's no surprise that they're combining the weapon and spell damage. They've done it with multiple other stats. I'm just waiting for them to get rid of this altogether. I think I, like probably many other people at this point, it's pretty easy to see the direction that they're heading. And eventually weapon and spell damage will also be a thing of the past. And we're just going to see a damage stat. You're going to see like offensive damage, whatever it is. The fact that they've been combining other stats and they've been doing it specifically with weapon and spell damage everywhere where it's seen, eventually this is just going to get replaced with an offensive damage stat. So it's not going to matter. And it makes sense. I mean, it's it's eliminating some of the uniqueness that it's had throughout the years, but at the same time, if I were attempting to deal with the programming, the development side of it behind the scenes, streamlining it wherever you can, where, you know, why do we need to have 2 different damage stats? Why do we need 2 different penetration stats? It's doubling the complexity of what we're having to track. So having a single stat where you had 2 before, from a development standpoint, becomes much easier to track, and then therefore there's less overhead when it comes to the performance. So it makes complete sense that they're looking to combine things. It makes it easier when you're theory crafting from a player standpoint too. It's less to deal with. So for the people that have been around for a while or since the beginning, you know the changes that have occurred. You've seen them over the years historically, what they've done. But I think most people would agree at this point that merging some of the generic stuff where it's been split for years into a single stat is actually ultimately going to be better for the game. If it helps performance, then that's a definite bonus. Oh, look at that. So I have a healer build. I don't play healers very often, but it looks like Magplar. So this was probably originally a tank build, like a blazing shield build, and I moved away from that particular playstyle, so I decided to go with a healer build just to have a dedicated healer. If I recall, it was probably for queuing reasons, so I had an alternative for queuing. Tanks are going to be the best, healers are going to be secondary, and then damage dealers are going to be third by a long shot in terms of queuing in the group finder. The time delays specifically. So if you queue as a tank, it's going to be the quickest time to get in. Queue as a healer, probably secondary, and then queuing as a damage dealer. A lot of times, depending on how busy it is, it can take 10 minutes to an hour plus. Not fun. So generally speaking, I like running dungeons, and so that's one of the reasons why I tend to tank a lot, is because it's the quickest queue time. So Bogdan, still really solid from a healing perspective. This is a really solid set. Hasn't seen any significant nerfs or anything over time. So you'll see this, I believe you'll probably see this even in trial content, but I don't tend to run trials, so I can't verify that, but this is solid enough. I can see it being used. Spell Power Cure or SPC, another still very solid set. I know a lot of people like Olarime, but again, I don't do trials, so if you don't have access to trial gear, SPC is a good alternative to Olarime. This is White Gold Tower as well. And Winter's Respite. Winter's Respite, so this is purely healing build then, the dedicated healer build. This is a really, really great back bar setup. This is an example of one of those areas where you could potentially run a split bar or separate, completely different set on the back. This is a buff that lasts for 10 seconds. So you can run it purely on the back bar, activate it, and then switch back to the front bar for the bulk of your healing or doing whatever you're doing, and then every 10 seconds you just make sure you're on the back bar. And it's extremely easy to proc. I can any ground-based AoE. So that's Wall of Elements, and you see the big frost circle. Anybody standing in that frost circle gets the buff. Oh, I'm bar swapping too quickly, sorry. Cats. So this provides a nice chunk of healing. 3668 health every 2 seconds. Every 2 seconds. I know a lot of their healing sets or some of the skills, they were making adjustments. Again, I assume this is for performance reasons, so there's less communication going back and forth between the client and the server. But they started switching a lot of the heals to every 2 seconds instead of every second. And typically they would kind of buff the heal accordingly. So if it was say it was 1,000 health per second, then they would buff it to 2,000 every 2 seconds. So at least the healing, the end healing was roughly the equivalent. But I found that I didn't like the adjustment nearly as much, because in 2 seconds something can one-shot you. Not that a heal over time is necessarily going to save you, but getting a heal every second versus a heal every 2 seconds, there is enough of a difference with that in that change that it does increase, decreases your survivability, increases the chances that you might die. Even though it doesn't sound like much, it's that extra second might be the key difference between living and dying. So healer setup, not. Like I said, I don't tend to play healer, so probably won't do anything with that for a bit. I could switch her to a Templar tank. I've had actually really good luck on my current account with the Tormentor set on a Templar, using their charge. Works really well. My main Magplar. For the exceptionally hard content, traditionally I've run Magplar. I like running all sorts of types of damage dealers. I mean, you can see I have a number of alts, but for survivability reasons, if the content is compared to what you're used to running, if the content is significantly harder, which each dungeon release that comes out, it seems like they tend to kind of buff it a little bit more, in terms of the damage output or the difficulty. Magplar is a fantastic choice. If you haven't set up a Magplar yet, they're great for damage, and their survivability factor is higher I don't know how much higher, but it's definitely higher than some of the other classes. Goes on. Actually, kind of damaged gear here. New Moon and Overwhelming. Okay, so we went over Overwhelming on the Sork as well, and I mentioned that it was really good for a Magplar as well. It is. It is definitely a good option. Especially as much as you're spamming your main spammable, for puncturing sweeps and various things. There's a lot of mag use during combat, so this brings a decent amount of sustain. Excuse me. Good sustain, good damage. Works well. I don't know that I would run Zon now. It's good for single target. There are probably better sets to run nowadays that still have a fun factor. I think I switched to this initially probably because I got through this. This was one of the areas that it took a bit longer for me to get through on Vet. That's primarily just based on my playstyle. As I mentioned, we're less focused. The people that I play with typically are less focused on damage, more focused on, okay, we play to the mechanics, we work through them, and we get through the content. I'm still working on hard mode achievements for a lot of the Vet dungeons, just because especially the later release DLC dungeons are quite difficult for their hard modes. Maybe not for endgame players, but we're not endgame players. We're working our way through the vet content. Excuse me, believe I've completed everything other than just the release that came out on a week or two ago, whenever the last DLC was. So I haven't run those dungeons, but all the other dungeons have completed on Vet. But the hard modes are still kind of out there in terms of achievements. We're still working on some of those. But Magplar is a great choice for the harder content, just because your main spammable is healing you while you're doing damage. You're getting an AoE cleave out of it. It's a pretty good setup. And you see here I'm still running Willpower on the back. So Willpower is the equivalent of Agility in terms of what it's bringing, but it's on the Magicka side. If you don't have a Maelstrom weapon, for Magicka, Willpower, or for Stamina, Agility, those weapons respectively are good alternatives until you can get around to getting Maelstrom. Okay. This is one of the... It's the skin from the dungeon that I mentioned earlier. Depths of Malatar. Yeah, that's the one. Despite other things coming out afterwards, I would still say that Depths of Malatar is one of the most difficult DLC dungeons that they've put out. Even still. The ones that they released right before the current ones, when they initially were released, they had some mechanics that were, I don't know if broken's the right word, but they were a bit OP. But I believe they've adjusted those now to where they're not as bad. I believe this is a werewolf tank. But if I recall, it's more like a tanky werewolf. I don't think it was designed for tanking so much as just being a defensive, survivable werewolf. I recall. I want to say this is like New Moon and Leeching, maybe? It was designed to go over as a support for PvP, both in human and werewolf form, primarily werewolf form though, to be able to take resources or other things, because it had the survivability, but it was also able to output damage. So Moleg Kina, werewolf, that makes sense. New Moon, that makes sense. And Leeching, yeah, okay. So Sword and Board, Leeching on the back, all of Leeching on the front, so you can swap back and forth between damage output and defensive in werewolf form. And then, of course, Kina and New Moon plus Maul are going to equal a decent amount of damage output as well. Leeching gives you the survivability plus the heavy. Yeah, so it's all heavy. So all heavy armor. All heavy plus the Leeching. Sword and Board for survivability, and then Kina plus New Moon plus Maul, Earnhound. Oh, and on a Warden, no less. I didn't even notice that. So this is a Warden build. Still sitting on 39,000 for health, which means your heal is going to be fairly solid too. Okay. Okay. Got the Celine's equipment, apparently. With creepy ghost spiders. Somebody's getting used to block casting or block canceling. Anyway, so this was kind of a little experimental, a little fun, another type of werewolf build basically that I put together. I like the damage dealing builds. Like I said, I've tried multiple times over the years. I've had different builds over the years. Some worked better than others, but almost all of them were lacking if you were going purely for damage. And if you go over to PvP, unless you're with a group of werewolves, which is fun, but unless you're with a group or have some really good support elements with you, it's difficult to survive. I don't think anything's changed in that regard. There have been definite times when werewolves were a little OP, things were being abused a bit, but when they're stable and when they're balanced, PvP in werewolf tends to be kind of hard to do unless you have folks running with you that can provide healing and kind of support you. So this was going this direction was kind of an attempt to alleviate that, where you're gaining some good additional defenses. Obviously, Leeching isn't going to necessarily work well because it's a static pool on the ground. Players can just step out of it. But so I wouldn't recommend it for battlegrounds, something like that. You wouldn't want to run Leeching because there's way too much movement, so you're never really going to gain much from that. But for Cyrodiil and taking resources specifically, whether there are other players there or not, you're still dealing with PvE elements, the guards and things that are attacking you. So there are typically plenty of things taking the outer keep resources or the keep itself, where guards are going to be standing in things, and potentially other players running through if it's chaotic, to where leeching can provide a nice benefit. So, Tynan Alabane, another Warden, where you can see we've moved from Templar over into the Warden class. I believe this was another not top end for damage build, but it was more of a fun build. I've tried over the years to do a bit of theming. I mean, it's fun. This is an RPG. So the theming element is fun, especially when you get into like elemental manipulation and that kind of thing. So Wardens were kind of the way they built them. There was a definite ice element to them. So this build, if I recall, was trying to tie into that while at the same time dealing out decent damage. So we've got Iceheart, which Iceheart has actually worked well for both mag and stam builds over the years, even though it's traditionally was more of a mag setup. I knew people that were actually running this in Maelstrom just for the added protection of the shield that it was giving. So it's definitely got a broader application than just mag builds. And when they made crit kind of a uniform stat and that kind of thing, this is, you can definitely use this across either now. Draugr. Oh, okay, Draugr. Ice Furnace. Okay. Draugr is single target. It's a 9-second cooldown, 6 seconds of extra damage, but this was another one that in testing for 4-man content and solo content, that extra line of penetration on the 3-piece makes a difference. I think that's a key difference, in fact, in terms of damage output. And then in addition to that, you're gaining almost 600 extra damage to your abilities. So if you have a decent amount of damage abilities, that actually is a nice buff. But I'm pretty sure this is curse on your enemy. Yeah, this is single target. So this is kind of like Zon in that it's good damage on whoever you happen to curse with it, but surrounding enemies obviously won't be taking that additional damage, and it's a 9-second cooldown before it attaches to anybody else. So, but overall for mobs, not a huge deal. And in fact, the Ice Furnace, this is kind of the balance to that. The Ice Furnace set actually is an AoE. Well, when you deal frost damage, I'm dealing frost damage with an AoE. You're doing frost damage with this. I believe goes out and seeks out. This will redirect damage back. That's single target. But back bar, I've got Wall of Elements with the Frost Staff. In addition to Winter's Revenge. So both of these are frost damage and an AoE, as well as Northern Storm is AoE frost damage. So all three of these basically are going to be putting out AoE damage, which then, in frost form, which then triggers the Ice Furnace set. So those same enemies are now taking 845 flame damage within 8 meters of the initial target. Oh, you know what? Actually, looking at this, you deal an additional flame damage to all enemies within 8 meters around the initial target. So it looks like I can even do single target damage. So if I just single target even this from the Frost Staff, would hit the initial enemy, and then everybody within that 8 meters around that enemy would take the fire damage as well. So it's got a combination. Oh, why am I doing this? I don't have a bag. It has a combination of... This makes me sad. I don't have my crafting bag. This also does frost damage when it activates out in a circle, so enemies hit with that. Just light, heavy attacks from the frost, that's going to be frost damage. Wall of Elements, it's an ice staff. So there's a lot of frost damage going out, and then they're taking AoE flame damage as well. So it kind of combines a decent amount of AoE plus a decent boost to single target. So it's good for mobs, and then when you do get to the boss, they're taking the AoE plus the single target boost to damage. So it's, I recall the damage output is actually pretty solid on this setup, but it is also heavily themed with the frost damage. You can tell from the sets that I'm running. I don't think he cares. Just wants to get to the bottom of his mug. Alright, buddy. We'll see you later. He's a Breton, too, in case I failed to mention that. So it is Magicka based. Who knows? Maybe they'll get to the point where they decide we're going to get rid of all split stats. No weapon and spell anything. Just pure damage. And then maybe they'll get rid of stamina and magicka as separate pools, and you just have a single resource pool. Although that would be definitely counter to the traditional Elder Scrolls approach on things. Okay, we're gonna I'm gonna cut it here again just for kind of optimal video length, and I'll pick it back up here with Arwen in the next video.